All right. So this is the slide we left off on the previous discussion, in the previous discussion. And we'll pick it up from here. Remember that we've only completed the first of the three metabolic pathways, the sum total of which amounts to this overall summary reaction. All we've done is completed glycolysis. We got to the end of glycolysis. We ended up with 2 pyruvate molecules. Now let's go into the Krebs cycle. Now remember that the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system take place inside the mitochondria. The glycolysis takes place outside. The other distinction of the Krebs cycle and electron transport system is that they both require oxygen. So this is a case where, say, after the marathon, when you're bent over gasping for breath, that oxygen that you're sucking in is to allow that pyruvate, that was the end product of glycolysis, now to be further processed in the Krebs cycle and electron transport system, because obviously we're not finished yet with fully processing the carbohydrate into energy. Pyruvate is the end product of glycolysis. You don't see pyruvate up here. You see carbon dioxide and water. So we haven't come close to fully processing the carbohydrate into carbon dioxide and water. We did see some water released in glycolysis right here, but there was no carbon dioxide released anywhere, and certainly oxygen wasn't used in glycolysis. So we have got a long way to go. The next pathway, the Krebs cycle, is like the second set of stairs. So let's go to the Krebs cycle, which is the next slide after fermentation. Here it is. And once again, you know, don't get nervous. We're not going to memorize these reactions. I'm going to take you on, again, a tour of the Krebs cycle and highlight what's important about the Krebs cycle. And those are the only things that I want you to remember. As you can see, the Krebs cycle is a cyclical pathway. It's cyclical for a number of reasons that I don't necessarily have to go into any detail about. But one of them is that the Krebs cycle not only processes carbohydrates, which is one of our sources of energy, it also processes lipids and, if we're starving, proteins. If I remember my biochemistry correctly, lipids enter the Krebs cycle somewhere around here, and I have to admit I forget where proteins enter the Krebs cycle. But it's kind of like, I remember, jump rope, where 2 people are holding the ends of the rope and twirling it while one person has to kind of take the opportunity to jump into the twirling rope. This is kind of the Krebs cycle. It's like the twirling rope. And lipids have to jump in here, and again, proteins jump in someplace else, and carbohydrates jump in right here. So that's one of the reasons for the cyclical nature of the Krebs cycle, is that it takes care of all 3 of our sources of nutrients. Protein's not necessarily a source of nutrients. We only metabolize proteins if we're starving to death. You know, it's the last thing that we metabolize in starvation. We shouldn't be processing our muscle tissue. But it's okay to process carbohydrates, of course. That's our blood glucose, and it's also okay to process lipids if we want to lose some body fat. All right, here's pyruvate right there. That's one of the 3 pyruvate molecules that were left over at the end of glycolysis. All right, the 3-carbon compound that you had two of at the end of glycolysis. And here's how it enters the Krebs cycle. A number of things to note about this very first reaction. One is that pyruvate can't get into the Krebs cycle unless it's ushered in with an enzyme called coenzyme A, or acetyl coenzyme A. It's like you can't get into a private club without having somebody who's already a member invite you to the club. And that's kind of like what this is like. So pyruvate can't get in unless it's ushered into the Krebs cycle on this, attached to this coenzyme A. Not necessarily the most important detail of that reaction. More importantly, is that this reaction is sufficiently exergonic to eject a high energy electron riding piggyback on a hydrogen atom. Just as we saw in glycolysis, where NAD, remember I've referred to it as a kind of a taxi cab that picks up high energy electrons occupying outer orbitals of their respective atoms and molecules, and have energy, potential energy, that can be harvested and used later on. And again, that taxi cab takes that high energy electron off somewhere, and where it takes it, its destination, we'll find out shortly. So that's one important thing that happens in the first reaction. The other important thing that happens in the first reaction is this: a carbon dioxide molecule is ejected. This carbon dioxide is the first carbon dioxide to be ejected that accounts for, let me quickly jump back here, the carbon dioxide in this reaction. It's some part, not all of the carbon dioxide, but a good, the first it's the first of the 6 carbons to come off of the carbohydrate, off the glucose molecule. Remember, glucose has 6 carbons. This is the first one to come off in the Krebs cycle. And this is where it does it in the Krebs cycle. Is right here. So again, you started with a molecule of glucose, which consisted of 6 carbons. This is one of those 6 carbons coming off of there. That's important. So, important things about the first reaction: it starts with pyruvate, the leftover product of glycolysis. It goes in the Krebs cycle, attached to acetyl coenzyme A. A high energy electron is ejected, and carbon dioxide. It's broken down to 5 carbons instead of 6, and one of the carbons comes off as carbon dioxide. Nothing much happens in the first couple of reactions. Let's skip to this reaction here. In this reaction here, very similar or identical to the first reaction, another high energy electron is ejected from the Krebs cycle, identical to the high energy electron riding piggyback on the hydrogen atom here. Same thing happens here, and is picked up by a taxi cab, NAD, nicotine adenine dinucleotide, and is taken off somewhere. And again, we'll catch up to it later. Also here, another carbon is ejected as carbon dioxide. This is the carbon dioxide that we exhale, by the way. So now we've accounted for 2 of the carbon dioxides that the glucose is broken down to. We have 4 remaining, right? Glucose starts with 6 carbons. We've taken off 2, 1 here, 4 remaining. That's all I need to say about that reaction. The very next reaction, same thing. A high energy electron is ejected, picked up by NAD, and another carbon dioxide comes off, the 3rd carbon. Now, since pyruvate only has 3 carbons, by this time we have completely broken down the pyruvate molecule into carbon dioxide. So as far as the pyruvate is concerned, we're finished with it. We could end the reaction right here because we have completely broken down the pyruvate to carbon dioxide. Except that, again, as I pointed out earlier, there are other purposes for the Krebs cycle: to pick up lipids somewhere in here and proteins somewhere along the way. Also, the other reason that we have these other intermediary compounds is that you basically can't get there from here. You can't draw a straight, there isn't one reaction that'll take you from succinyl-CoA to oxaloacetate. You have to go through these intermediate compounds to get back to this position here. The other reason is that you have several more exergonic reactions in the Krebs cycle where high energy electrons are being ejected. Here and here. Here, a high energy electron is being ejected, picked up by NAD, just as we've seen before. Here, another, a taxi cab from a different company Instead of nicotine adenine dinucleotide, this is flavin, Flavin adenine dinucleotide. It's got a bigger taxi cab. It can carry 2 high-energy electrons, riding piggyback on hydrogen atoms instead of just 1. All right. Now, why evolution stuck in FAD there? Probably because there were 2 high-energy electrons available to be ejected in this exergonic reaction going from succinate to fumarate. So why not pick them both up? NAD can only attach 1, so evolution invented FAD to pick up both of those high-energy electrons. That's it. That's really all I want you to remember about the Krebs cycle. Is that there are a number of places, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places altogether where high-energy electrons are being ejected, picked up by NAD and FAD. That by the time you get over here, you've accounted for 3 carbon dioxides, which accounts for the 3 carbons of pyruvate. Remember, though, that there are 2 pyruvates coming off glycolysis. So the second pyruvate is waiting in line behind the first pyruvate to go through the Krebs cycle. So for 1 molecule of glucose, the Krebs cycle has to go around twice to completely process all 6 carbons that were part of that 6-carbon glucose molecule. So for 1 glucose molecule, again, the Krebs cycle has to go around twice to produce 6 carbon dioxides. 1, 2, 3 times 2 pyruvates, 6 carbon dioxides. And again, that's it. I think that's all we need to, cover about the Krebs cycle. We are now at the bottom of the second set of stairs. All right, at a landing at the bottom of the second set of stairs. Middle of the afternoon, so we can crack open a beer and have a slice of pizza before we move on. All right, let's move on. Here's the. I want to go back. Sorry, I'm doing it this way. A little awkward. We are now going to go down the third set of stairs called the electron transport system. You might be, if you're particularly astute, sitting there wondering, well, wait a minute, didn't we completely break up the glucose molecule in the Krebs cycle? We accounted for all 6 carbons of the glucose molecule in the Krebs cycle. What is left to do? Right? If in the Krebs cycle we've taken both pyruvates and turned them into carbon dioxide, what is there left to do? Well, to partially answer that question, yes, we've accounted for the carbon dioxide. By the time we get through the Krebs cycle, you've produced 6 carbon dioxide, which accounts for the 6 carbons in the glucose molecule. We produced some water in glycolysis. Did we eject any water in the Krebs cycle? No, we didn't emit any water in the Krebs cycle. We used some water in the Krebs cycle. So we haven't accounted for the water. We haven't fully accounted for a lot of the water. So the water has sort of a dotted line under it because we produced some water in glycolysis. We accounted for 6 carbon dioxides. We've completely broken down the glucose, but here we haven't used any oxygen yet. And I said that the Krebs cycle requires oxygen. And I didn't lie to you, but we haven't used the oxygen in the Krebs cycle directly. We produced a little bit of energy. Remember those 2 ATP, the net ATP that we produced in glycolysis? And that's about all the energy, the useful biological energy that we've produced so far. So we haven't really produced a lot of energy for our effort. So obviously there are still components of this reaction that are not accounted for. So let's go on to the next slide after the Krebs cycle, which is the electron transport system here. The electron transport system, again located in the mitochondria, is a series of enzymes called cytochromes. Just a special name for these particular enzymes. They're molecules. like any other molecule, but they have a specific function. What they do is, and this is where we finally get around to finding out where the NAD and the FAD were, the taxi cabs were taking their fares, their high energy electrons riding piggyback on the hydrogen atom. So here they are. We produced several in glycolysis and several more in the Krebs cycle, and again, only for one molecule of glucose. So there's, if we had that whole bowl of pasta, there's a gazillion NADs and FADs lining up at the head of the cytochrome system with their fares. Now they're going to drop off their fares. They're going to drop off the high energy electrons riding piggyback on the hydrogen atoms. Now what does that mean? That means that the electron is occupying an outer orbital on the hydrogen atom. Just bear that in mind. That draws on that background information, the backstory that I gave you before I even started discussing metabolism with you. Delta G orbitals and electrons occupying high and low energy orbitals. So these electrons attached to these hydrogens are occupying high energy orbitals. The taxicabs drop off the fares. The hydrogen with their high energy electrons are handed to the first cytochrome. I told you that anytime, so that's a chemical reaction, right? We're breaking off the hydrogen and attaching it to the first cytochrome. It's a chemical reaction. And I told you that anytime we make or break chemical bonds to carry out a chemical reaction, it's like musical chairs. Electrons change their orbitals. Some electrons fall from high to low orbitals. Some electrons are raised from low to high orbitals. In this case, well, not so much in the first reaction. When the electron is handed off to the first cytochrome, not much happens. But let's start with the first cytochrome. So the first cytochrome has the hydrogen with the high energy electron, hence the negative charge here. It passes it on to the next cytochrome. In other words, carries out a chemical reaction in which it breaks off the hydrogen from this cytochrome and hands it to that one, the second one in line. When it does that, when that chemical reaction is carried out, the high energy electron occupying an outermost orbital on the hydrogen falls to a lower energy orbital in the second cytochrome. Again, the high energy electron orbiting an outer orbital on this cytochrome, on the hydrogen atom on this cytochrome, when the hydrogen atom is passed to this cytochrome, that electron falls to a lower orbital, lower energy orbital. That delta G difference between a high energy orbital and the low energy orbital is given off, is emitted. It is captured by ADP. Remember ADP, adenosine diphosphate, the energy currency molecule. That energy, this is an exergonic reaction. Obviously, when the electron falls from a high to low energy orbital, and the energy is given off, the delta G is given off. It's an exergonic reaction. That's what the E stands for right here. And that energy is used to attach a phosphate, a terminal phosphate, onto ADP, making it ATP. And earlier I explained that ATP is the coin in the pocket. We made 2 in glycolysis, no big deal, but it was enough to get bacteria by and get life started on the planet. But now we're making more ATP. So we're getting some additional currency in our energy currency in our pocket. You can sort of see where I'm going with this. As the second cytochrome passes again, the hydrogen atom with its electron not occupying an outermost orbital now, but still occupying a high energy orbital to the third cytochrome, that electron again falls from a relatively high energy orbital to a lower energy orbital. That delta G, the E, the energy difference comes off and is used to phosphorylate yet another adenosine diphosphate to ATP. More currency, more energy currency in our pocket. Hydrogen atom is passed to the fourth cytochrome. Electron falls yet another orbital, and that delta G is used to phosphorylate another ADP to ATP. And so on, and so on, and so on, until you come to the end of the cytochrome system. it's like a bucket brigade, right? I mean, every cytochrome passes the bucket, the hydrogen atom, to the the downstream cytochrome, if you will. And every time that happens, the electron occupying a higher energy orbital falls to a lower energy orbital, and that delta G is used to phosphorylate in ADP to ATP. So in other words, a lot of ATP created from the NADs and the FADs that picked up high energy electrons in glycolysis in the Krebs cycle. A lot more than the two that were generated in glycolysis. And like a bucket brigade, if the last person in the bucket brigade doesn't unload his or her buckets, just hangs on to them, all the other people in the bucket brigade have to hang on to their buckets because they've got nowhere to pass them to, you know. So the last person in the bucket brigade, the last cytochrome, has to hand off the hydrogen atom with its electron to something in order to free it up to get more hydrogen atoms from the upstream cytochromes, obviously. However, the electron occupying the hydrogen atom at the end of the cytochrome system now occupies a low energy orbital on that hydrogen atom. It started off occupying a high energy orbital, fell to consecutively lower energy orbitals as it went from cytochrome to cytochrome, ended up in a lower energy orbital at the end of the cytochrome system, and that hydrogen atom with its low energy electron is now handed off to oxygen. If you combine hydrogen and oxygen in the right ratios, you get water. Now we have accounted for the oxygen that we inhale, that's the oxygen that we inhale, and the water in the overall summary reaction. Oh, I just wanted to say something and it slipped my mind. So this is the oxygen that we inhale. And when we allow the hydrogen from the last cytochrome to come off and combine with that oxygen, we get water. Oh, this is what I was going to say. Now, the hydrogens that we've attached to this oxygen have electrons on them that are low energy. They occupy the hydrogen atom in a low energy orbital. I want to stress that, because when we talk about photosynthesis in our very next discussion, that's going to become important. Water is referred to as a low energy compound because its electrons occupy primarily low energy orbitals. Glucose, what we started this whole metabolic process with, is considered a high energy compound because its electrons occupy high energy orbitals. So that's it. That's all you need to remember about the cytochrome system. It is essentially a bucket brigade whereby hydrogen is passed from one cytochrome to the next. And in so doing, the electron occupying that hydrogen atom keeps falling to lower and lower energy orbitals. The delta G, the positive delta G coming off of those reactions, is used to phosphorylate many ADP to ATP. This is where the bulk of the ATP in metabolism is generated. It's not generated in glycolysis. It's not generated that much in the Krebs cycle. There is one ATP generated in this reaction here. I didn't mention it earlier. This reaction here is sufficiently exergonic to phosphorylate an ADP to ATP. So yeah, the Krebs cycle produces 2 ATP from one glucose molecule. Gives, again, you go around twice for one glucose molecule and you get 2 ATP. Again, not a lot of energy. The bulk of the ATP generated from heterotrophic metabolism is in the electron transport system. The thing is, though, that's what I wanted to say earlier. The electron transport system relies on oxygen to free it up, for oxygen to take the hydrogen atoms. That allows the electron transport system to continue. Because again, if the last person doesn't dump the buckets, then everybody has to hold on to the buckets because everybody has buckets and no one's dumping them or passing them on, and the whole process stops. So the last cytochrome has to hand off its hydrogen atoms to oxygen. And again, I forget where I was going with that. Yeah, it'll come back to me. So what have we accounted for here? Let's go back to this reaction. We started with a molecule of glucose. The oxygen here is the oxygen right here in the cytochrome system. The oxygen that we inhale that allows the cytochrome system to dump its hydrogens and continue. Well, that's what I was going to point out. When I said that the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system require oxygen, the Krebs cycle does not require oxygen itself directly, but the Krebs cycle is intimately linked to the electron transport system. The Krebs cycle can't go on its own if the electron transport system doesn't process the NADs and the FADs coming off the Krebs cycle. So these two are connected to one another in that the Krebs cycle can't go unless the electron transport system goes. And the electron transport system requires oxygen. So therefore, both of these require oxygen in order to allow them to proceed. So we've accounted for the glucose, which we started this whole process with, right? Let's go back here. There's the glucose at the beginning of glycolysis. We accounted for the oxygen, which picks up hydrogens at the end of the cytochrome system. We accounted for the carbon dioxides, which come off in the Krebs cycle, here, here, and here. And we accounted for water at the end of the electron transport system, because when you combine hydrogen coming off the cytochromes with oxygen, you get water. And finally, the energy at the end of the overall summary reaction of heterotrophic metabolism is accounted for right here by all these ATPs that we've produced. Again, from one molecule of glucose. And in fact, we ate a whole bowl of glucose, gazillion glucose molecules in this pasta here. So, so there, we have now counted. You can put a solid line under all of these compounds in the overall summary reaction of metabolism, because we've gone through these three pathways to account for all of them. If we look at, I could have used, I forgot I had a slide here right after the electron transport system that I could have used. So there it again, in all its glory, is the overall summary reaction of heterotrophic metabolism. Again, this is the only reaction I want you to remember. You don't have to remember any of those other intermediate reactions in glycolysis and Krebs cycle. You do have to remember, the highlights that I pointed out. If we now go to the next slide, here's sort of an accounting, a spreadsheet of what happened. We got 2 ATPs in glycolysis, remember? We got 2 ATPs in the Krebs cycle, those 2 ATPs I pointed out a moment ago, right here. We go around twice, so 1 ATP times 2 is 2. And that's those 2. However, one glucose molecule generates enough NADs and FADs to produce 32 ATPs. So the total number of ATPs that we get from one glucose molecule is 36 ATPs. 36 ATPs from one glucose molecule. And if you look up the electron volts, the amount of energy that a single ATP has, 36 isn't bad. That's a lot of energy from one glucose molecule. And again, I'm not going to go back to the slide, but we ate that whole bowl of pasta. That's a lot of energy for you now to have to go and metabolize. So now you go for a walk, you walk the dog, you walk to school, you go for a bike ride. Or you don't. You go sit on the couch and binge watch, Breaking Bad. That energy can't be created nor destroyed. So your body says, yeah, you're not going to burn it, and then we're going to have to store it. And that's where your love handles come from. So, Yeah, okay, before we go to the next slide, yeah, I just want to gather my thoughts for a moment. In our next discussion, just to preview it a bit, we're going to talk about photosynthesis. And I want to point out some things before we get into the details of photosynthesis, which, by the way, is not going to take nearly as long as metabolism because you already know the backstory. Photosynthesis, again, relies on electrons occupying orbitals around atoms, so you already know that principle. We don't have to revisit that. Remember where I said a few moments ago that glucose is a high energy compound because its electrons occupy high energy orbitals. Water, at the end of metabolism, is a low energy compound because electrons around the hydrogen in particular occupy low energy orbits. In photosynthesis, we start with water. Instead of ending with water, we start with water and carbon dioxide. The electrons around the hydrogen atoms in water occupy low energy orbitals. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to raise those electrons to high energy orbitals in glucose. Where we extracted the energy from electrons falling from high energy orbitals to low energy orbitals in heterotrophic metabolism, we have to essentially push the rock uphill now and raise the electrons from low energy orbitals to high energy orbitals in water, combine it with carbon dioxide to make glucose. That will require energy. It's not going to produce energy. This is an exergonic reaction. This is an anergonic reaction. So we're going to have to invest energy in order to raise those electrons up. Where does the energy come from? It comes from sunlight. So that's the nature of photosynthesis. Photons, electromagnetic energy is used to raise those electrons in these hydrogen atoms from low to high energy orbitals. You can then combine the water with the carbon dioxide to make glucose. So without going into any details of how that happens, that's essentially the point of photosynthesis. All right, the overall purpose of photosynthesis is to use sunlight to hoist those electrons into high energy orbitals in glucose. And we'll pick that up in our next discussion. Again, stay well. Try to have fun being isolated, and we'll talk soon.